house with the baby and never return back again.
Please, calm down and give me another chance.
Never, I won't.
Get out. You and that baby out of my house now. He screamed at his 8 months pregnant wife on New Year's Day, shoving her toward the door while her best friend stood in the doorway, wearing his mother's heirloom ring like a trophy. They threw her into the freezing night with nothing but the clothes on her back, laughing as she begged him to reconsider their unborn child. What he didn't know, the worthless small-town girl they'd spent 2 years destroying had just inherited a fortune from a father she never knew existed, and what she did next didn't just ruin them. It erased them from existence. Hello, beautiful soul. Welcome back to my channel. Before anything else, I want to say thank you. Your comments, your support, your time, it means everything to me. You're not just viewers, you're family. Now we're at 9K subscribers, and my mom said we'll never hit 10K this new year. I told her she's wrong, that I have a beautiful family here who believes in these stories. So before we start, prove her wrong. Subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and comment where you're watching from. Let's hit 10K together and show her what this family is made of. Now let's dive in. The iron gates opened slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the Winterbourne estate itself was deciding whether Alara Whitmore deserved to enter. She sat in the back of the car Garrett had sent for her, hands folded in her lap to stop them from trembling, watching the mansion grow larger with every second. 3 stories of white stone, columns that belonged in history books, windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back like they were hoarding secrets. This was the world she was about to step into, and God, she hoped she was ready. The car stopped. The driver opened her door. Alara stepped onto gravel that crunched under her shoes, expensive gravel that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe, and for a moment she just stood there, staring up at the house that seemed to stare back. Her simple dress suddenly felt cheaper than it had that morning. Her carefully chosen shoes felt wrong. Everything felt wrong except the hammering of her heart that told her this moment mattered more than anything else in her life. She walked forward because there was nothing else to do. The front doors opened before she reached them, handled by staff she didn't see. And then she was inside, and the world changed completely. Marble everywhere, white and gray and polished, so bright it looked wet. Chandeliers hanging from ceilings too high to touch, dripping with crystals that scattered light across walls covered in paintings of people who looked like they'd never smiled in their lives. The air smelled like money, old and confident, mixed with fresh flowers and something else she couldn't place. Power, maybe. Or control. Miss Whitmore. The voice came from above, smooth as silk and just as expensive. Alara looked up and her breath caught. A woman was descending the staircase, and she didn't walk so much as float, each step perfectly placed, perfectly timed. Marguerite Winterbourne. She'd seen photos, but they hadn't prepared her for this. The cream dress that fit like it had been sewn onto her body. The hair swept back without a single strand out of place. The pearls at her throat that caught the light and held it. The perfume that reached Alara 3 seconds before the woman did. Subtle but unmistakable, announcing her presence like a bell that only the wealthy could hear. Marguerite reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, her eyes moving over Alara with the precision of a jeweler examining a diamond. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, she said nothing, just looked, and Alara felt every flaw in her appearance magnified under that gaze. Then Marguerite smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "My dear, you are absolutely lovely." She stepped forward, took both of Alara's hands in hers, and the warmth of that touch made something tight in Alara's chest loosen. "Garrett told me you were beautiful, but clearly my son has trouble with accurate descriptions. You're stunning." Heat flooded Alara's face. "Thank you, Mrs. Winterbourne. I'm honored to be here. Your home is beyond anything I imagined." Marguerite squeezed her hands gently, her grip firm but kind, and pulled her closer. "Please, we're going to be family. Call me Marguerite. That dress is perfect for you. Simple, elegant, refined. You have wonderful taste, my dear. So many girls your age think more is better, but you understand restraint. That's rare." "Did she?" Alara had spent 3 paychecks on this dress, changed her mind 6 times, almost returned it twice. But Marguerite's approval felt like being wrapped in warmth, and she let herself believe maybe she'd done something right. Maybe she could belong here after all. There she is. The voice was deeper, familiar, and it sent a rush of relief through her. Garrett appeared in the doorway, tall and perfect in clothes that probably cost more than her rent. His smile the same one that had made her fall for him in the first place. He crossed the hall in 4 long strides, took her hand from his mother, and pulled her close enough that she could smell his cologne. "You made it. I was starting to worry you'd change your mind." She meant to sound confident, but her voice came out softer, more vulnerable than she wanted. "Not a chance. Though I did get lost twice." He brushed his thumb across her knuckles, slow and deliberate. "Should have sent a driver with better directions. Or better yet, I should have picked you up myself." He said it like he meant it, his eyes locked on hers, and for a moment the massive hall, the watching mother, the overwhelming wealth, all of it faded until it was just the two of them. That familiar flutter in her stomach made her forget every doubt she'd had on the drive here. Marguerite cleared her throat softly, elegantly, and the moment broke. "I'll let you two have some time together. Alara, we'll have tea in an hour. I want to know everything about the woman who's captured my son's heart." She smiled, touched Alara's cheek with one cool hand, and glided away, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded like music. Garrett waited until his mother disappeared down a hallway, then pulled Alara closer, his arm around her waist. "Breathe. You look terrified." She laughed shakily. "I'm not terrified. I'm just aware that everything here costs more than my car, and I'm afraid to touch anything." He grinned, that easy confidence that came from never having to worry about money or consequences. "Touch whatever you want. Break something if it makes you feel better. We have insurance. Come on. Let me show you around before Mother interrogates you." They moved through rooms that felt less like living spaces and more like exhibits in a museum someone forgot to open to the public. A library with shelves reaching toward a ceiling painted with clouds and cherubs, books that looked older than the country, leather chairs positioned by windows that overlooked gardens stretching so far she couldn't see where they ended. A dining room with a table that could seat an army, set with china so thin she could see light through it. A music room with a piano that gleamed like black ice, sheet music arranged on a stand even though she bet nobody actually played it. Every room was perfect. Every room felt untouchable. Every room made her more aware that she came from a world where furniture came from stores with sale signs and dishes were bought in sets of 4, because that's all you needed. Garrett gestured toward the dining room. "This is where we'll have dinner tonight. Just family. Mother, my sister Caroline, and us. Nothing formal." Alara's stomach tightened. "Your sister? I didn't know she was coming." He said it casually, but something in his tone shifted. "She lives here. Well, part-time. She's in and out. She's excited to meet you. Don't worry." But Alara was worrying, because the way he said "don't worry" made it sound like she absolutely should worry. And now she was running through every possible way to make a good impression on a sister she knew nothing about. They walked back to the sitting room, and Marguerite was already there. Tea service arranged on a low table, like she'd conjured it from thin air. 3 cups, 3 saucers, everything matching, everything perfect. She poured without looking, handed Alara a cup painted with roses so delicate they looked real, and settled into her chair with the posture of someone who'd never slouched in her life. "So Alara." Marguerite lifted her cup, sipped, and her eyes never left Alara's face. "Tell me about your family. Garrett's been frustratingly vague, and I want to know who raised such a lovely young woman." The question felt like stepping onto ice. Alara set her cup down carefully, buying a second to think. "My family's small. It's just me and my mother now. My father passed away when I was 7. Marguerite's face softened. "I'm so sorry, dear. That must have been terribly difficult. And your mother, what does she do?" Alara smiled, thinking of her mother in a classroom full of kids, patient and kind and everything good. "She's a teacher. Elementary school. 2nd grade. She taught me to read before I started kindergarten." I was reading chapter books in first grade. A teacher. Marguerite repeated the word slowly, like she was tasting it, testing it. How admirable. But something changed in her expression, subtle as a shadow passing over water. The warmth in her eyes dimmed by a fraction, just enough to notice if you were paying attention, and Alara was paying attention to everything. Teaching is such important work. So selfless. The word selfless hung in the air like a judgment. Alara felt it land, felt the shift in temperature, but kept her smile in place. She loves it. She says there's nothing better than watching a child discover they can read. Marguerite set her cup down with a soft click that sounded louder than it should. I'm sure. And you grew up where exactly? Alara kept her voice steady, but she could feel the scrutiny tightening around her. A small town upstate. Population around 3,000. You wouldn't have heard of it. It was a good place to grow up. Safe. Quiet. Everyone knew everyone. Marguerite smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes this time. Charming. Small towns have a certain simplicity to them, don't they? A slower pace. Different values. The pause before simplicity stretched just long enough to turn the word into something else. Something less flattering. She picked up her cup again, sipped, and when she looked at Alara this time, it was with the expression of someone recalculating an equation that wasn't adding up the way she'd expected. Garrett leaned forward, his hand finding Alara's knee, squeezing gently. Alara went to college on a full academic scholarship. Top of her class all 4 years. Marguerite's eyebrows lifted, interest flickering back. Did she? What did you study? Alara felt the ground stabilize slightly. Literature. I wanted to be a writer. I still write actually. Short stories, mostly. Just for myself. Marguerite's approval returned, but it felt thinner now, more fragile. How wonderful. Garrett mentioned you were well read. That's so refreshing. So many young people these days have no appreciation for real literature. She sipped her tea again, her voice lighter, almost conversational. And your mother's home, where you grew up, what was it like? Alara gestured around the room, trying to make it sound charming instead of inadequate. Small. Cozy. Nothing like this. We had a little garden out back. My mother grew tomatoes every summer. Marguerite nodded and filed that information away somewhere behind her polite smile. How lovely. There's something to be said for modest living. It builds character. Translation delivered with perfect diction. You're not like us, but maybe we can fix that. The conversation continued, light and polite on the surface, but Alara felt every question like a test she hadn't studied for. When she mentioned working part-time jobs through college, Marguerite praised her work ethic, but the praise felt hollow, performative, like checking a box on a form. When she talked about her mother's friends, the tight-knit community, the potluck dinners and borrowed cups of sugar, Marguerite smiled and said it all sounded very sweet. But sweet the way you'd describe a child's drawing, not something you'd actually want on your wall. By the time tea was over and Garrett walked her back to the hall, Alara's head was spinning. She'd passed something, she thought, but she'd also failed something else she couldn't name. Garrett kissed her at the door, told her he'd call her tonight, told her his mother adored her. But as Alara drove away from the estate, watching those iron gates close behind her in the rearview mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just been measured against a standard she didn't know existed, and the results were still being calculated somewhere in Marguerite Winterbourne's perfectly organized mind. Would you have noticed it too? That first flicker of judgment hidden behind a smile? Or would you have believed the warmth was real, and the afternoon had planted something else, something she'd carry with her through everything that came next, the understanding that acceptance in this world came with conditions she was only beginning to see, and the real test hadn't even started yet. The months that followed felt like living inside a dream Alara wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. Garrett called every evening at 7. His voice warm and steady through the phone, asking about her day, telling her about his, making plans for the weekend that always involved something she'd never done before. Private dinners at restaurants where the menus had no prices. Theater boxes where you could see the actors' expressions from your seat. Weekend trips to his family's cabin upstate that turned out to be a 7-bedroom lodge with staff who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. He was attentive in ways that made her feel seen, cherished, like she was the only woman in the world who mattered. But there were moments, small ones at first, where his attention felt less like devotion and more like direction. "Wear the blue dress tonight, not the black one. Blue suits you better," said with a smile, a kiss on her forehead. His hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward the closet. "Maybe skip the wine at dinner. You get a little too relaxed after the second glass." Delivered with a laugh, like it was a joke they both shared, except she hadn't realized it was something he'd been noticing. "Let me order for you. I know what's good here." And she'd let him, because he did know, because everything he chose was perfect, because it was easier to trust his judgment than question why hers wasn't enough. The Winterbourne family dinners became a regular fixture every other Sunday, formal without being called formal, where Alara learned the invisible rules by breaking them. She spoke when spoken to. She complimented Marguerite's choices in decor, in menu, in conversation topics. She laughed at Caroline's stories about her social circle, women with names like Prescott and Vanderberg who summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. She stayed quiet when the men discussed business, even though she had opinions, even though she'd studied economics in college and understood half of what they were debating better than they did. Marguerite watched everything. Her smiles came with assessments attached. "Ilara, darling, that's a lovely dress. Did you choose it yourself? The implication is clear. Maybe you shouldn't. You have such a sweet laugh. So genuine. So unguarded." Translation: you need to learn control. Caroline was more direct. Over coffee one afternoon, while Garrett was away on business, she leaned across the table and smiled like they were sharing secrets. "You know, Garrett's had girlfriends before. Lots of them. But he's never brought one home to meet Mother this early. You must be special." Alara smiled back, warmth spreading in her chest. "I hope so." Caroline's smile didn't waver. "Just remember, this family has expectations. We're not like other families. We have a reputation to maintain a legacy. The women who marry into the Winterbournes become part of something bigger than themselves. It's an honor, but it's also a responsibility." The words felt like a warning wrapped in encouragement, and Alara nodded, because what else could she do? Felicity Dane appeared in Alara's life like a fairy godmother she hadn't asked for. They met at one of Marguerite's charity luncheons, a room full of women in pearls and designer suits, talking about fundraising goals and committee appointments like they were discussing the weather. Felicity was stunning in the effortless way only money and confidence could create. Her blonde hair swept into a twist. Her dress the kind of simple that cost thousands. She approached Alara during the reception, champagne glass in hand, smiling bright and genuine. "You're Garrett's girl. I've heard so much about you." Alara shook her hand, trying not to feel intimidated. "All good things, I hope." Felicity laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Of course. Marguerite adores you. She told me you're exactly what Garrett needs. Someone real, grounded, refreshing." She said it like it was the highest compliment, and maybe in this world it was. "I'm Felicity, by the way. Old family friend. Grew up with Garrett and Caroline. If you ever need anything, advice, help navigating the circus, call me." Seriously, she handed Alara a card with her number written in perfect script. It can be overwhelming, joining a family like this. Trust me, I've seen it happen. You need an ally. And Felicity became exactly that, or so it seemed. She called to check in, invited Alara to lunch, offered advice on everything from what to wear to Winterbourne events to how to handle Marguerite's subtle criticisms. When she suggests something, just agree. It's easier. Fighting her is exhausting and you never win. They'd be sitting in a cafe, Felicity picking at a salad, Alara grateful for someone who seemed to understand. And if she makes one of those comments about your background, smile and change the subject. She's not trying to be cruel. She just comes from a world where lineage matters. You can't change that. You can only work around it. Alara absorbed every word, trusting that Felicity wanted to help, not seeing the way Felicity's suggestions slowly shaped her into someone quieter, more compliant, more willing to accept diminishment as affection. When Alara mentioned wanting to apply for a writing fellowship, Felicity frowned thoughtfully. Are you sure that's a good idea? Garrett's so busy with work right now. He probably needs you to be available, supportive. Fellowships are demanding. Maybe wait until after the wedding. It made sense when Felicity said it. It made sense when Garrett echoed the same concern a week later, almost word for word. I just want to make sure I'm there for you, Ilara explained. Garrett kissed her temple. And you are. You're perfect. But it started feeling like a cage with invisible bars. At a family dinner 3 months into their courtship, Ilara mentioned her mother's upcoming birthday, asking if they might visit her small town for the weekend. The table went silent. Marguerite set down her fork with deliberate care. Oh, darling, I'm sure your mother would understand if you celebrated with her another time. We have the Vanderbilt Gala that weekend. It's important for Garrett to attend, and of course you'll be with him. It wasn't a question. Ilara looked at Garrett, hoping for support, but he was nodding agreement. Mother's right. The gala is important for business connections. Your mom will understand. We'll send her flowers, something nice. And just like that, the decision was made. Her mother's birthday traded for networking opportunities. She wouldn't even participate in beyond standing next to Garrett and smiling. She called her mother that night, voice tight with guilt. I'm so sorry, Mom. I can't make it this weekend. Her mother's voice was gentle, understanding in that way that made Ilara's chest ache. It's okay, sweetheart. You're building a new life. I'm proud of you. But Ilara heard the disappointment underneath, the loneliness her mother would never admit to. And she wondered for the first time if building this new life meant abandoning the old one completely. The pattern continued, subtle and relentless. Her opinions became suggestions that were gently redirected. Her preferences became opportunities for Garrett to guide her toward better choices. Her stories about her childhood, her mother, her small-town life, were met with polite smiles that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes, or worse, with comments that felt like compliments but landed like criticisms. You have such charming stories, Ilara. So simple, so pure. It's wonderful that you appreciate the little things. Marguerite said it at dinner, and the whole table murmured agreement. But Ilara heard what wasn't being said. Your life was small, insignificant, nothing like ours. When she tried on a dress she'd bought herself for an upcoming event, Garrett looked at her with gentle disappointment. It's nice, sweetheart, but maybe not quite right for this crowd. Let me take you shopping. I want to buy you something special. And she went because refusing felt ungrateful, because his taste was impeccable, because the dress he chose was objectively beautiful even if it didn't feel like her. She stood in front of the mirror in silk that cost more than her monthly rent and barely recognized herself, and Garrett stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, smiling at their reflection. Perfect. You look like you belong. Did she? Or did she just look like someone pretending? Felicity was always there with reassurance, with explanations that made Ilara's doubts seem silly. They're just trying to help you fit in. It's not personal. They do this with everyone. But did they? Or was Ilara special in her need to be molded, shaped, corrected? The questions started keeping her up at night, whispers in her mind she couldn't silence. By the time Garrett proposed, 6 months after that first visit to the estate, Ilara said yes without hesitation because she loved him, because she wanted to believe the fairy tale was real, because walking away would mean admitting she'd spent half a year becoming someone she didn't recognize for a family that still looked at her like she didn't quite belong. He proposed at sunset on the estate grounds, the ring a diamond so large it felt heavy on her finger, his family watching from the terrace above, champagne already chilled and waiting. Marguerite hugged her, whispered in her ear, "Welcome to the family, darling. We'll take good care of you." And Ilara smiled, because that's what you do when your dream comes true, even when some quiet part of you wonders if dreams are supposed to feel this much like surrender. Would you have seen the warning signs? Or would you have convinced yourself that love requires compromise? That fitting in means letting go of the parts of yourself that don't match? She chose to stay, chose to believe, chose to ignore every instinct screaming that something was wrong, because leaving would mean facing the truth that she'd given up too much for too little, and she wasn't ready for that truth yet. The engagement ring sat heavy on Alara's finger, a constant weight that reminded her she belonged to something bigger now, something that came with rules she was still learning. The wedding was 8 months away, planned down to the last detail by Marguerite and a team of coordinators who consulted Alara on nothing that mattered. Flowers? They asked her opinion, then chose what they'd already decided. Dress? They took her to a boutique where every gown cost more than a car and nodded approvingly when she picked the one Marguerite had pointed to first. Menu? Garrett squeezed her hand and said, "Trust Mother on this one. She knows what works for these events." And Alara nodded, because fighting felt exhausting, and she was already so tired. The dinners at the Winterbourne estate shifted from bi-weekly to weekly, then to twice a week, until it felt like she lived there more than in her own small apartment. Each meal was a performance she hadn't auditioned for, every course served with a side of evaluation. Marguerite's compliments arrived wrapped in correction. "Alara, darling, you look lovely tonight, though perhaps a bit more jewelry next time. We want you to sparkle, not fade into the background," said with a smile that made it impossible to argue, a touch on her arm that felt affectionate and controlling at once. "Your table manners are improving, dear. I noticed you remembered to place your napkin correctly. Such small things make such a difference." Praise for behavior Alara hadn't known was wrong until it was being corrected, and the praise itself felt like a reminder that she'd been inadequate all along. Caroline joined these dinners more frequently now, her presence a mix of boredom and judgment. She'd talk about her friends, women with trust funds and husbands in finance, dropping names like weapons, watching to see if Alara recognized them. "You know Bitsy Harrington, don't you? Her family owns half of Connecticut." "No." "Oh, well, I suppose you wouldn't travel in those circles," said innocently enough, but the message landed like a slap. "You're not one of us. You never will be." Alara smiled through it, kept her voice pleasant, asked polite questions that showed interest without revealing ignorance. She'd learned that admitting she didn't know something was worse than pretending, that gaps in her knowledge of their world were character flaws that needed hiding. One evening, Caroline leaned across the table during dessert, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Alara, I've been meaning to ask, where did you say your people were originally from?" The question itself was innocent. The way she asked it wasn't. "My mother's family is from upstate, been there for generations. My father's side, I'm not entirely sure. He passed away when I was young." Caroline nodded slowly, processing this like it confirmed something she'd suspected. "So no real family history to speak of. How interesting. Most families around here can trace their lineage back centuries. It's rather important, knowing where you come from." Marguerite intervened smoothly, her voice gentle but firm. "Caroline, darling, not everyone has the privilege of documented ancestry. What matters is who Alara is now, and who she's becoming." But the defense felt worse than the attack, because it confirmed that Alara's background was something that needed defending, something lacking that required apology. Felicity remained her constant companion through all of it, always available with advice that somehow made Alara feel smaller, while claiming to help. They met for lunch at least once a week, always at places Felicity chose, always restaurants where Alara felt underdressed no matter what she wore. Felicity would order for both of them, salads with dressing on the side, sparkling water instead of wine. "Trust me, you want to see your figure now. Wedding dress fittings are brutal, and photographers are merciless." She said it with such concern that Alara ignored the fact that she'd never worried about her weight before, that she'd been perfectly happy with her body until Felicity started suggesting otherwise. These lunches became tutorials in how to be a Winterbourne wife, lessons Alara hadn't asked for, but absorbed anyway. When Marguerite criticizes you, and she will, just smile and thank her. She's grooming you, making you better. It's actually a sign she cares. Felicity picked at her salad, her voice matter of fact. And when Garrett's colleagues' wives talk to you at events, let them lead the conversation. Don't bring up your writing or your college degree. It makes them uncomfortable. Just ask about their children, their charity work, the safe topics. Alara set down her fork, something tightening in her chest. Why would my education make them uncomfortable? Felicity looked at her with something like pity. Because it reminds them you had to work for things they were given. It highlights the difference. You don't want to emphasize how different you are, Ilara. You want to fit in. The fitting in required erasing pieces of herself bit by bit. So gradually she barely noticed until the gaps became obvious. She stopped mentioning her mother in conversations after Marguerite changed the subject one too many times with a polite but dismissive, "How nice, dear." She stopped sharing stories from her childhood after Caroline laughed at her description of a county fair, calling it charmingly provincial, in a tone that made it clear provincial wasn't a compliment. She stopped talking about books she loved after Garrett's business partner's wife wrinkled her nose and said, "Oh, I only read contemporary bestsellers." Literary fiction is so pretentious, and everyone nodded agreement while Ilara's degree in literature sat silently devalued. At a dinner party 6 months into the engagement, Ilara made the mistake of expressing an opinion about a business deal Garrett was considering. The men had been discussing it openly, and she'd done similar analysis in College Marriage happened on a Saturday in June with 300 guests Ilara didn't know and a reception that cost more than most people earned in a year. She walked down an aisle lined with white roses imported from Ecuador, wearing a dress that had required 6 fittings and cost $60,000, toward a man she loved and a family she was beginning to fear. Garrett's smile when he saw her was genuine, his vows spoken with emotion that made her believe everything would be worth it, that love could survive the slow erosion of self she'd experienced over the past year. They honeymooned in the Maldives, 2 weeks of private beaches and overwater bungalows where she could almost forget the life waiting back home. But the honeymoon ended, as honeymoons do, and Ilara returned not to her small apartment, but to the Winterbourne estate, to rooms that had been prepared for her, to a life that had been designed without her input. The East Wing was theirs, Marguerite explained, giving them privacy while keeping them close. Families should stay together, especially at the beginning. You'll need guidance, support as you adjust to married life. Garrett agreed so quickly that Ilara realized the decision had been made long before anyone thought to include her in the conversation. The estate became her world. It rules her reality. She learned which rooms were hers to use and which required permission. The library was always open, but the study was Garrett's domain. The gardens were lovely for walking, but the West Terrace was where Marguerite took her morning tea, and interrupting was unthinkable. The kitchen was staffed by people who smiled politely and ignored every suggestion she made about meals, deferring instead to menus Marguerite had approved weeks in advance. Ilara was mistress of a house she had no power in, a title without authority, and every day reminded her of that truth. Marguerite observed everything with the focus of a scientist studying a specimen. She noticed when Ilara rearranged the flowers in the entrance hall and had them changed back within an hour. She commented when Ilara wore casual clothes to breakfast, her tone light but pointed. "Darling, we do maintain certain standards, even at informal meals. Perhaps something a bit more structured." She monitored who Ilara spoke to among the staff, which rooms she entered, how she moved through the space that was supposedly her home. "You're doing wonderfully, dear," she'd say, and then list 3 things that needed improvement, criticisms disguised as helpful observations that left Ilara feeling like she was failing a test she hadn't known she was taking. The dinner parties were the worst, events that happened twice a month, where the Winterbournes entertained business associates, old family friends, people whose approval mattered, for reasons Ilara didn't fully understand. She'd dress in clothes Garrett chose, jewelry Marguerite loaned her, and smile through conversations that felt like verbal minefields. "So you're from a small town, how quaint. What did your father do?" The question came from a woman in diamonds that could fund a hospital wing, her smile curious and cruel at once. "He passed away when I was young," Ilara replied, keeping her voice steady. "Before that, he worked in manufacturing." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly, a reaction so subtle most people wouldn't catch it, but Ilara had learned to read these micro-expressions. Manufacturing. How industrious. The word industrious delivered like an insult wrapped in politeness, and Ilara felt Garrett's hand tighten on her waist, a warning or support she couldn't tell. Another guest, a man who'd gone to prep school with Garrett, leaned in during cocktails with bourbon-fueled confidence. Garrett's a lucky man, marrying for love instead of lineage. Very modern of him. My wife and I, well, our families practically arranged it before we were born. He laughed like this was charming instead of horrifying. But you got that wholesome small-town thing going. I'm sure that's refreshing for him. And Alara smiled because what else could she do? Smiled while being reduced to a novelty. An experiment in marrying beneath one station. Smiled while Garrett stood 3 feet away and didn't correct any of it. Felicity was always present at these events, moving through the rooms like she owned them, comfortable in a way Alara would never be. She'd appear at Alara's elbow with advice delivered as concern. You're being too quiet tonight. People will think you're unfriendly. Try engaging more. Or 5 minutes later, you're talking too much about your opinions. Remember, listen more than you speak. Contradictory guidance that left Alara paralyzed, unsure whether to speak or stay silent, trapped between being too much and not enough. During one particularly brutal dinner party, Alara overheard Felicity talking to Marguerite in the hallway, their voices low, but not low enough. She's trying, I'll give her that. But some things can't be taught, can they? Breeding, real breeding, it shows. Marguerite's response was softer, harder to hear, but Alara caught enough. Garrett chose her, so we'll make it work. She's malleable at least. That's something. Malleable. Like she was clay to be shaped, a project to be completed, not a person to be respected. Alara stood frozen on the other side of the wall, her champagne glass shaking in her hand, realizing that every kindness, every piece of advice, every moment of guidance had been part of a larger plan to remake her into someone acceptable. She wanted to confront them, to walk into that hallway and demand to be seen as she was, but fear kept her still. Fear of losing Garrett, fear of being cast out, fear that they were right and she was fundamentally inadequate for the life she'd married into. The social gatherings became exercises in endurance. Comments about her modest origins were layered into seemingly innocent conversation, like landmines waiting to detonate. Did you grow up going to cotillion? No. Oh well, not everyone has that opportunity. I'm sure your mother's dinner parties were lovely in their own way. Different but lovely. You must find our traditions so foreign. Don't worry, you'll catch up eventually. Each remark landed with precision, designed to remind her she was other, less than conditionally accepted at best. Even her clothing became a source of constant evaluation. Marguerite developed a habit of glancing at Alara's outfit and making small sounds, not quite disapproval, but not quite approval either, letting the ambiguity do the work of criticism. When Alara wore a dress she'd bought herself, Marguerite would say, "How colorful," in a tone that suggested color was a mistake. When she wore something Garrett had chosen, Marguerite would nod with satisfaction. Much better. You're learning. Learning what? How to erase herself. How to become a reflection of their expectations rather than a person with her own taste, her own voice, her own worth. Garrett's attention, once so focused and adoring, started carrying an edge she couldn't quite name. He'd comment on her posture at dinner, her laugh that was sometimes too loud, her tendency to use her hands when she talked. Just relax, sweetheart. You don't need to be so animated. Subtle is better here. He'd remind her which topics to avoid in conversation, which opinions to keep to herself, which parts of her personality to tamp down for the sake of maintaining harmony. I'm not trying to change you, he'd say when she looked hurt, pulling her close, kissing her forehead. I'm just helping you be the best version of yourself. But the best version apparently meant the quietest, the most agreeable, the most willing to disappear into the background of her own life. She'd lie awake at night next to him, listening to his even breathing, wondering when she'd stopped recognizing herself in mirrors, when her own voice had started sounding foreign, when she'd traded her identity for acceptance and gotten neither. There were moments she'd catch glimpses of her old self, fierce and certain, but they came less frequently now, drowned out by the constant noise of correction and judgment that filled every day in the Winterbourne house. One evening, 3 months into the marriage, Alara's mother called, her voice warm and familiar and painful to hear. "Sweetheart, I haven't seen you in so long. When can you come visit?" Alara looked across the room at Garrett, deep in conversation with his mother about quarterly earnings, and felt the weight of impossibility. Soon, Mom. I promise. Things are just really busy right now. Her mother's silence stretched too long before she responded. Busy is one thing. Forgotten is another. I miss my daughter. The words hit like a punch, accurate and devastating, and Alara blinked back tears she couldn't let fall. Not here, not where Marguerite might see and interpret as weakness. I haven't forgotten you. I could never forget you. But didn't she? Hadn't she let them slowly separate her from everything she'd been before, everyone she'd loved, until the only life that remained was this one, beautiful and suffocating and entirely not hers? She ended the call with promises she wasn't sure she could keep, and when Garrett asked who it was, she said, nobody important, and watched his approving smile and hated herself for the lie. Would you have called your mother back? Would you have admitted the truth, that you were drowning in silk and marble and expectations, that the fairy tale had become a prison, that you'd given up everything and gotten nothing but conditional acceptance in return? Or would you have done what Alara did, which was smile through dinner, laugh at the right moments, and let another piece of yourself die quietly while everyone congratulated you on how well you were adjusting? 2 years into the marriage, Alara discovered she was pregnant. She took the test alone in the marble bathroom of the East Wing, hands shaking as the second line appeared, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than numb acceptance. Joy, pure and uncomplicated, the kind she'd almost forgotten existed. A baby, her baby, something that would be hers in a way nothing else in this house could be. She told Garrett that evening, and his face lit up with genuine happiness, the man she'd fallen in love with breaking through the careful mask he'd worn for so long. He pulled her into his arms, kissed her, called her amazing, told her she'd be an incredible mother. For 3 perfect minutes, she believed everything would be different now, that a child would bring them back to each other, would remind everyone that she was more than a project to be perfected. Then Marguerite found out. She appeared at their door within an hour, summoned by Garrett's excited phone call, and her smile was warm, but her eyes were already calculating. A grandchild. How wonderful. We'll need to prepare properly, of course. The nursery should be in the south wing, near my rooms, so I can help during those difficult first months. Not a suggestion. A decree. And Alara watched Garrett nod agreement, watched her joy being organized and scheduled and managed before she'd even had time to process it herself. The pregnancy became a winter-born production, managed by Marguerite with the efficiency of a military campaign. Doctor appointments were scheduled and attended not just by Garrett, but by his mother, who asked questions Alara should have been asking, made decisions about care plans without consulting her, spoke about the baby like it was a family asset being properly maintained. We'll want the best pediatrician, naturally. I've already spoken to Dr. Harrison. He delivered Caroline and Garrett, very experienced with prominent families. Alara tried to interject, tried to mention she'd researched doctors herself, had preferences, but Marguerite smiled and patted her hand. Of course, dear, but let's trust the experts. You're doing the hard work of carrying the baby. Let us handle the details. And Garrett, predictably, sided with his mother, assuring Alara that she should focus on staying healthy and let them worry about logistics. She was 8 months pregnant and had somehow become a spectator in her own life's most significant event. Felicity's visits increased during the pregnancy, always timed perfectly, always with advice that felt more like instruction. She'd appear for afternoon tea, her thin frame making Alara feel massive and ungainly by comparison, offering tips on maintaining elegance while pregnant. You'll want to be careful about weight gain. Marguerite was just mentioning that some women let themselves go during pregnancy and never recover. You're doing well so far, but watch those last few months. Said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, planting seeds of insecurity that bloomed into full anxiety by evening. The whispered conversation started around month 7. Fragments Alara would catch when she entered rooms. Words cut off mid-sentence, looks exchanged that she wasn't meant to see. Felicity and Marguerite in the garden, their heads close together, separating quickly when Alara appeared with an enthusiasm that felt performative. Garrett and his mother in the study, voices low and serious until Alara knocked, then shifting immediately to cheerful small talk. Caroline stopped by more often than usual, always finding reasons to pull Garrett aside for private conversations that lasted too long. Something was building, a pressure she could feel but couldn't name, and every instinct she'd learned to ignore over the past 2 years screamed warnings she forced herself not to hear. During a dinner party in late November, Alara noticed Felicity and Garrett talking on the terrace, visible through the French doors, but far enough away that their words were lost. Felicity's hand on his arm, her laugh too bright, his posture closer than necessary. When they came back inside, Felicity's lipstick was slightly smudged, Garrett's collar just barely off-center, and Alara felt ice flood her veins. She watched them the rest of the night, catching glances between them that lasted a fraction too long, seeing him fetch Felicity's drink before his pregnant wife's, noticing the casual intimacy of people who'd spent time alone together. When she mentioned it to Garrett later, carefully, trying not to sound accusatory, he laughed it off. "Felicity? We've known each other since we were kids. She's like a sister." But sisters didn't look at brothers the way Felicity looked at Garrett, and brothers didn't touch sisters' backs the way Garrett's hand lingered on Felicity's spine when he thought no one was watching. The New Year's Eve party was announced in early December, an annual winter-born tradition that had apparently been paused for several years and was being revived for reasons no one bothered to explain to Alara. Marguerite planned it with unusual intensity, her focus sharp and purposeful, making decisions about guest lists and seating arrangements with the precision of someone orchestrating something far more significant than a party. "It will be the perfect way to introduce your pregnancy properly to our social circle," she explained, though Alara had been visibly pregnant for months and everyone already knew. "We'll make it a celebration of new beginnings." The words felt loaded, heavy with meaning. Alara couldn't decode, but she was 8 months pregnant and exhausted, and had long since learned that questioning Marguerite's plans was pointless. Felicity volunteered to help with preparations, spending hours at the estate conferring with Marguerite, the two of them disappearing into the study for conversations that ended when anyone else approached. Alara tried to involve herself in the planning, but was gently, firmly excluded from every significant decision. "You need to rest, dear. Growing a baby is work enough. Let us handle the party." And so she rested, or tried to, while preparations swirled around her and the feeling of impending catastrophe grew stronger with each passing day. Christmas came and went with manufactured joy and expensive presents she didn't want. Garrett gave her diamond earrings that cost more than her mother's annual salary, and Alara smiled and thanked him while wondering when he'd stopped knowing her well enough to realize she'd have preferred a handwritten letter or a quiet evening alone. She gave him a first edition of his favorite book, something she tracked down over months of searching, and he seemed genuinely touched until Marguerite commented that it was sweet but impractical, and then his appreciation dimmed to polite acknowledgement. On Christmas night, Alara called her mother, desperate for connection to the person she used to be, and her mother's voice broke when she asked, "Are you happy, sweetheart?" "Really happy." And Alara lied, said of course she was, said everything was perfect, while tears ran silently down her face and Garrett's family laughed in the next room over some joke she hadn't been invited to understand. Would you have told the truth? Would you have admitted you were trapped in a life that looked perfect from outside, but felt like drowning from within? Or would you have protected your mother from worry, kept your suffering private, because admitting failure felt worse than enduring misery? The final week before New Year's Eve passed in a blur of preparations and mounting anxiety Alara couldn't explain. She'd wake up at 3 in the morning, her heart racing, the baby moving restlessly inside her like it sensed something wrong. Garrett was distant, distracted, always busy with work or family matters that didn't include her. Marguerite was overly solicitous, checking on her constantly, offering help with things Alara didn't need help with, her kindness feeling more like surveillance than care. Felicity stopped by daily, now always cheerful, always helpful, always present in a way that felt invasive and intentional. The letter arrived 3 days before New Year's, slipped under their bedroom door in the early morning. Expensive stationery with embossed letterhead. Alara found it while Garrett was in the shower, addressed to both of them in formal script. From Sloan Merrick, attorney at law, regarding estate matters requiring her attention. She started to open it, curious about estate matters she knew nothing about, when Garrett emerged and took it from her hands. "I'll handle this. Probably just some legal paperwork for the baby, trust fund stuff. Don't worry about it." He tucked it into his jacket pocket and left for work, and Alara stood there, wet from the shower he'd interrupted, wondering why a letter addressed to both of them was something only he needed to see. She thought about it all day, that letter, the casual way he'd taken it, the slight tension in his shoulders when he'd said don't worry. That night, she searched his study while everyone slept, looking for the letter, finding nothing but impeccably organized files that revealed nothing suspicious. But in the back of a drawer, she found a folder labeled Miscellaneous, with copies of emails between Garrett and someone named Merrick from 6 months ago, messages about trusts and inheritances and her father's estate, words that made no sense because her father had died with nothing, had left nothing but memories, and a watch she kept in her jewelry box. Why was Garrett discussing her father's estate? What estate? What was she missing? She confronted him the next morning, the folder in her hands, her voice shaking with something between fear and anger. "What is this? What aren't you telling me?" Garrett looked at the folder, and something flickered across his face too fast to read before his expression smoothed into careful concern. "Sweetheart, you're stressed. The pregnancy, the party preparations, it's a lot. Let me handle the complicated stuff." He tried to take the folder, but she held it away. "These emails mention my father. They mention an estate. I deserve to know what this is about." His jaw tightened, just barely, just enough. "It's nothing. A clerical error. Your father and someone else with the same name got mixed up in some old records. I was handling it for you. Didn't want to bother you with pointless paperwork." It sounded plausible. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing Garrett would handle without telling her. Exactly the kind of protection he'd claim was for her own good. But something in his tone felt wrong, and Alara filed that wrongness away with all the other small inconsistencies she'd been collecting for months. A pile of evidence that pointed towards something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. She let him take the folder, let him kiss her forehead and reassure her, but she didn't believe him, and from the slight relief in his eyes, he knew she didn't believe him, and they both pretended the conversation had resolved something when all it had done was confirm they were lying to each other about things that mattered. New Year's Eve was 2 days away, and Alara stood in front of her closet, choosing a dress for a party that felt less like celebration and more like execution, her hands resting on her swollen belly, protecting the one thing in her life that was purely hers. She didn't know what was coming, but her body knew, had known for months, and as she looked at her reflection, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Where had she gone? That girl who'd walked through iron gates 2 years ago with hope in her heart. And would whatever happened next destroy what little remained of her? Or would it finally set her free? The morning of December 30th arrived with frost covering the estate grounds like a warning Alara couldn't read. She woke alone, Garrett's side of the bed already cold, and the silence in the house felt different, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. She dressed slowly, her pregnant belly making every movement deliberate, and made her way downstairs to find the house already alive with activity she hadn't been informed about. Staff moved through rooms with purpose, rearranging furniture, polishing silver that was already spotless, preparing for the New Year's Eve party with an intensity that seemed excessive even for Winterbourne standards. Marguerite stood in the center of the grand hall directing operations like a general preparing for battle, her voice calm but commanding, and when she saw Alara on the stairs, her smile was bright and immediate and somehow terrifying. "Good morning, darling. Sleep well? Don't worry about any of this. We have everything under control. Why don't you rest in the sitting room? I'll have tea brought to you." It wasn't a suggestion, and Alara found herself guided gently but firmly to the sitting room, settled into a chair with pillows arranged around her, tea appearing within minutes, and the distinct feeling that she was being kept out of the way rather than cared for. Felicity arrived mid-morning, letting herself in like she lived there, which lately felt almost true given how much time she spent at the estate. She found Alara in the sitting room, and her smile was all concern and affection, But something in her eyes didn't match, something calculating that Alara had started noticing more frequently. How are you feeling? You look tired. Are you sleeping enough? She settled into the chair across from Alara without waiting for invitation, crossing her legs with the casual elegance of someone completely comfortable in spaces that would never truly belong to Alara. I'm fine. Just restless. The baby's been active. Felicity's gaze dropped to Alara's belly, and for just a second, something flickered in her expression that looked almost like resentment before it vanished behind sympathy. That must be exhausting. You know, I was talking to Garrett yesterday about how much you're handling. The pregnancy, the party stress, living here with his family. It's a lot for anyone. The words were supportive, but the tone carried an edge, like she was testing something, probing for weakness. Alara straightened despite her discomfort. I can handle it. I've handled everything they've thrown at me for 2 years. Felicity tilted her head, studied her with that calculating look again. Have you thought? Handled it, I mean? Or have you just endured it? There's a difference. The observation landed like a slap because it was true, devastatingly true, and Alara had no response that wouldn't confirm it. Before she could formulate words, Marguerite swept in with her usual impeccable timing, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. Felicity, wonderful. I need your opinion on the seating arrangements. Alara, dear, you just relax. She ushered Felicity out before Alara could protest, and through the open door, she caught fragments of their conversation as they moved down the hallway. Marguerite's voice, lower than usual, but still audible. Everything is proceeding according to plan. He's committed, finally. It just needs to happen cleanly. And Felicity's response, eager and satisfied. I've waited long enough. Tomorrow changes everything. The words stopped Alara's heart. She sat frozen in her chair, her tea going cold in her hands, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard, but knowing, somewhere deep in her gut where truth lives before the mind accepts it, exactly what it meant. Something was happening tomorrow. Something involving Garrett. Something Felicity had been waiting for. And Alara, 8 months pregnant and increasingly invisible in her own home, was somehow at the center of it, without having been told she was even part of the equation. She spent the rest of the day watching, paying attention to details she'd been too tired or too defeated to notice before. The way Marguerite and Felicity moved through the house together, conferring in corners, sharing looks that spoke of shared knowledge and shared purpose. The way Garrett avoided her, claiming work kept him busy even though she could see him through the study window, staring at nothing. His phone in his hand like he was waiting for courage to make a call he didn't want to make. The way Caroline stopped by in the afternoon and the three of them, Marguerite, Felicity, and Caroline, disappeared into the West Wing for an hour, their voices occasionally rising just loud enough for Alara to hear tones, if not words, excitement and anticipation, and the unmistakable sound of conspiracy. By evening, Alara's hands were shaking. She found Garrett in their bedroom, dressing for dinner, and confronted him with a directness that 2 years of conditioning hadn't completely destroyed. What's happening tomorrow? What are you planning? He turned, surprise clear on his face before control slid back into place. It's a party. New Year's Eve. You know this. His tone was patient, condescending, the voice he used when he thought she was being emotional or irrational. That's not what I mean. I heard your mother and Felicity talking. They said everything proceeds tomorrow, that it needs to happen cleanly. What happens cleanly, Garrett? His expression hardened, the warmth she'd fallen in love with completely absent. You're stressed. The pregnancy has you imagining things. There's nothing happening except a party. But he wouldn't meet her eyes when he said it, and Alara knew with absolute certainty that he was lying, and had probably been lying for months, maybe longer. She tried a different approach, her voice softer, appealing to the man she'd married rather than the stranger he'd become. Please. If something's wrong, if you're unhappy, just tell me. We can fix it. We can figure it out together. For a moment, just a moment, something broke through his carefully maintained facade. Guilt, maybe. Or regret. His hand lifted like he might touch her face, comfort her, explain. Then his phone buzzed, he glanced at it, and whatever softness had appeared vanished instantly. There's nothing to fix. You're overthinking. Now get dressed for dinner. We're expected downstairs in 20 minutes. He left the room without waiting for a response, and Alara sank onto the bed, her baby moving inside her like it could feel her distress, and she finally admitted what she'd been avoiding for months. Her marriage was over. Had been over, maybe, long before she'd realized it was dying. Something tomorrow would make that official, would transform her private suspicions into public humiliation, and she was trapped, pregnant, and powerless, in a house full of people who'd been planning her downfall, while smiling to her face. Would you have seen it coming? Would you have recognized the signs earlier, or would you have done what Alara did, which was trust and hope and believe that love could survive calculated cruelty? She wanted to run, to pack a bag and leave tonight, drive to her mother's house and never look back. But where would she go, 8 months pregnant with no money of her own, no job she'd been allowed to keep, no independence she hadn't traded for security that turned out to be a cage? Dinner was unbearable, a performance of normalcy that everyone participated in except Alara. Garrett was charming, attentive even, serving her food and asking about her comfort like he was husband of the year. Marguerite was gracious, discussing tomorrow's party arrangements and complimenting Alara's dress and acting like she wasn't orchestrating something that would destroy the pregnant woman sitting at her table. Felicity joined them, uninvited but expected, and the way she looked at Garrett, possessive and certain, made Alara's stomach turn. They talked around her, through her, occasionally to her, but never with her. And she understood that this was practice, a rehearsal for a future where she simply wouldn't be present anymore and they'd all be perfectly fine with her absence. After dinner, she excused herself early, claiming exhaustion wasn't a lie, and retreated to the bedroom that felt less like sanctuary and more like a cell. She couldn't sleep. Her mind raced through every interaction, every whispered conversation, every moment over the past months that she'd dismissed as paranoia. The way Felicity always seemed to know things about Garrett's schedule before Alara did. The private jokes between them that excluded everyone else. The touches that lasted too long. The looks that communicated without words. How long had they been planning this? Had Garrett ever really loved her? Or had she been a temporary deviation from a future that had always included Felicity? Had Marguerite known from the beginning, tolerated Alara only until they could dispose of her cleanly, as she'd said, without scandal or complication? At midnight, unable to stand not knowing anymore, Alara left the bedroom and made her way through the dark house toward Garrett's study. She'd learned his filing system over 2 years of marriage, knew where he kept important documents, and if there was evidence of what was coming, it would be there. The study was dark. The door unlocked, because they still trusted she was too broken to fight back. She found the Merrick folder again, this time reading every page carefully, and the truth hit her like physical violence. Her father, the man she remembered as kind and simple and poor, had been someone else entirely. The documents outlined a trust established decades ago, $70 million held in a complex structure, released to his heir upon his death, but with conditions, paperwork, legal requirements that had taken years to process. Years that had apparently concluded 6 months ago, right around the time Garrett had become distant and Felicity had become omnipresent. The inheritance was hers. $70 million she'd never known existed. And somehow, her husband and his family and her supposed best friend all knew about it before she did. The next document made everything clear. A proposed divorce settlement, already drafted, generous by normal standards but laughable considering what she actually owned. Contingent on her signing away rights to marital assets and agreeing to specific custody arrangements. They'd been planning this for months, waiting until after the baby was born probably, except something had changed their timeline. Maybe they got impatient. Maybe they thought they could push it through while she was still pregnant and vulnerable. Maybe they'd always planned to do it at the party, a public declaration that would make fighting back impossible without causing a scene, and Alara had been trained for 2 years to never, ever cause a scene. She took the documents every page and returned to her room as dawn started breaking outside. She should have felt destroyed, devastated by the confirmation of every fear. Instead, she felt something else stirring, something she'd buried under 2 years of compliance and conditioning. Anger. Pure, clean, clarifying rage at the people who'd taken her trust and twisted it into a weapon against her, who'd seen her kindness as weakness and her love as something to exploit. They thought she was broken, manageable, easy to discard. They thought wrong. The baby moved inside her, strong and insistent, and Alara placed her hands on her belly and made a promise. Whatever happened tomorrow at that party, whatever humiliation they had planned, she would survive it. More than survive it. She would make them regret ever underestimating the small-town girl they'd spent 2 years trying to destroy. She didn't know yet how, didn't have a plan, but she had something they didn't know about. Knowledge of the inheritance, knowledge of her own worth, and the element of surprise that came from everyone believing she was too defeated to fight back. Tomorrow, they would try to break her in front of their entire social circle. Tomorrow, she would show them that some things, once broken, become sharp enough to cut. Would you have confronted them immediately? Would you have demanded explanations and apologies and justice right then? Or would you have done what Alara did, which was wait and watch and let them walk into the trap they didn't know they'd set for themselves? Let them think they'd won right up until the moment everything reversed? New Year's Eve was hours away, and Alara dressed with careful precision, choosing her armor for a battle only she knew was coming. The estate transformed into something from a magazine cover by the time guests started arriving at 7. Crystal chandeliers blazed with light that cascaded across marble floors polished to mirrors, reflecting back a world of wealth and power that had never truly included Alara despite 2 years of trying. Ice sculptures shaped like swans guarded the entrance hall. Champagne fountains bubbled in the ballroom, and waiters in white gloves moved through crowds of people who'd spent more on their shoes than most families spent on rent. Alara descended the staircase at 7:30, 8 months pregnant in a dress that cost a fortune and felt like a costume. One hand on the railing for balance, the other resting on her belly, where the baby moved restlessly. Every eye turned toward her, conversations pausing mid-sentence, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, assessment and judgment and curiosity about the girl who'd married into the Winterbourne family and still somehow didn't quite fit. Marguerite stood at the bottom of the stairs in silver silk that probably cost more than a car, her smile perfect and predatory, her eyes tracking Alara's every movement. "Darling, you look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy suits you." She took Alara's hand as she reached the last step, squeezed it gently, and whispered so only Alara could hear, "Remember to smile tonight. No matter what happens, keep smiling." The warning was clear even if the threat remained unnamed, and Alara felt ice slide down her spine despite the warmth of the crowded room. Garrett appeared from the ballroom, devastating in a tailored tuxedo that made him look like old money personified, and for a moment when their eyes met, Alara saw the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd promised forever in a voice that sounded like he meant it. Then Felicity materialized at his elbow, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her dress a deep red that screamed confidence and claimed territory, and the illusion shattered. Garrett approached, kissed Alara's cheek with the practiced warmth of a politician greeting constituents, and guided her into the ballroom where hundreds of guests mingled beneath chandeliers that cost more than most houses. "Stay close," he murmured against her ear, his hand firm on her lower back, steering her through the crowd. "Mother wants us to greet the Hendersons first, then the Vanderbergs, then we'll do the receiving line." He recited the schedule like it mattered, like this was just another party, and not the orchestrated dismantling of her life, and Alara let him guide her, because fighting now would accomplish nothing except alerting them that she knew. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk, Alara's face aching from smiling, her feet swelling in shoes that hadn't fit properly that morning and definitely didn't fit now. People congratulated her on the pregnancy, asked about due dates and names and nursery preparations, and she answered with the appropriate responses while watching Garrett and Felicity from the corner of her eye, noting how they orbited each other even when apart, how his gaze found her across the room, how her smile promised things that had nothing to do with friendship. At 9, Marguerite called for attention, her voice cutting through conversation with the authority of someone who'd never been ignored in her life. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate with the Winterbourne family as we welcome a new year and new beginnings. She raised her champagne glass, her smile encompassing the entire room, but landing specifically on Alara with something that looked like pity disguised as affection. To family, to tradition, and to the courage it takes to make difficult decisions for the greater good. The toast was met with cheers and raised glasses, but Alara heard the subtext loud and clear, the coded message to everyone who mattered that something significant was about to happen, and they should pay attention. Garrett touched her elbow, his grip gentle but insistent. Come with me. Mother wants to speak with us privately. Not a request. Alara followed him through the crowd, feeling eyes track their movement, whispers starting before they'd even left the ballroom. They walked down the familiar hallway toward the sunlit drawing room, though at night it was lit by lamps that cast long shadows across furniture that had witnessed generations of winterborn decisions. Marguerite was already there, Felicity beside her, both of them standing like they'd been waiting, like this moment had been planned down to the minute. Caroline sat in one of the chairs, her expression a mix of discomfort and anticipation, and Alara realized with sick certainty that this was it, the moment they'd been building toward, the clean ending Marguerite had promised would happen tonight. Garrett closed the door behind them, the click of the latch sounding like a cell locking, and when he turned back his face was carefully blank, empty of everything except determination. Alara, we need to talk. His voice was steady, rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech multiple times until the emotion was completely drained from it. Our marriage, it's not working. It hasn't been working for a long time, and I think you know that. The words landed but didn't hurt, not the way they should have, because she'd been expecting them, had felt them coming for months. What hurt was the relief in his voice, the eagerness barely concealed beneath false regret. She said nothing, just stood there with her hands resting on her pregnant belly, waiting for him to finish the speech he'd prepared while she slept beside him, trusting him. You're a good person, you tried your best, but you don't fit here. You never did. We forced something that wasn't meant to be, and continuing would be unfair to both of us. Marguerite stepped forward, her hand touching Alara's arm with manufactured sympathy. Darling, this is for the best. You're young. You'll find someone more suitable to your background, your temperament. Someone from your world. Translation. Someone poor, someone insignificant. Someone who won't require the constant work of molding and managing that you demanded. We've prepared very generous terms for the separation. Full medical care for the pregnancy, a reasonable settlement, visitation arrangements that prioritize the child's well-being. She gestured toward a folder on the side table, documents already drawn up, already signed by everyone except Alara, just waiting for her compliance to make it official. Felicity moved closer to Garrett, her body language screaming ownership, and when she spoke her voice carried victory barely tempered by false compassion. I know this is hard, Alara, but Garrett and we have history. We make sense together in ways you two never could. You'll understand someday that this is actually kindness. The audacity of it, the sheer cruelty of explaining betrayal as a favor, made Alara's vision blur red at the edges. She looked at Garrett, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the man who'd courted her, who'd promised forever, who'd made love to her just weeks ago, and whispered that she was everything he needed. Nothing. Just calculation and impatience, and the clear desire for this conversation to be over, so he could get back to the party, and the life he'd already moved on to. You've been planning this for months. Her voice came out stronger than she expected, steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. The emails, the lawyers, the inheritance you thought you'd access through me. You knew about my father's trust before I did. Garrett's expression flickered, surprise breaking through his rehearsed composure. That's not, it's more complicated than you think. But it wasn't complicated at all. It was brutally simple. They'd used her, planned to discard her, timed it for maximum humiliation in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle, so she'd have no choice but to comply quietly or become the hysterical pregnant woman making a scene. They thought she'd choose quiet. They'd trained her for 2 years to choose quiet. Marguerite's voice hardened, the sympathetic mask slipping to reveal the steel underneath. Alara, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Sign the papers. Accept what we're offering. Fighting will only make things ugly, And you don't want that, especially not for your child. The threat was clear. Comply, or they'd make her life hell. Use their money and connections and power to destroy whatever shreds of dignity she had left. Caroline spoke for the first time. Her voice carrying genuine discomfort that was at least more honest than everyone else's performance. Just sign it, Elara. They've already decided. You can't win against them. And Caroline was right, or would have been right if Elara was the same broken woman who'd endured 2 years of subtle destruction without fighting back. But something had shifted last night when she'd read those documents, when she'd realized that everything they'd done was based on underestimating her, assuming she'd stay defeated, believing she had no power. They were wrong. The inheritance they'd been planning to access through her, it was hers, completely hers, uncontestable and already processed. The generous settlement they were offering, pennies compared to what she actually owned. The custody arrangements that prioritized the child's well-being, laughable when she could afford better lawyers than they'd ever imagined. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd worn in months, sharp and cold and absolutely done with performing. No. The word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Garrett blinked. What? His confusion would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. I said no. I'm not signing anything. Not tonight, not ever on your terms. Elara's voice was steady, each word deliberate and sharp. You want a divorce, Garrett? Fine. But we'll do it properly, with lawyers and courts and full financial disclosure. All of it. Marguerite's expression shifted from confident to concerned, her eyes narrowing. You're being emotional. Think about what you're doing. But Elara was thinking, clearer than she had in 2 years. And what she was thinking was that these people had underestimated her so completely they'd handed her every weapon she needed to destroy them. I know about inheritance. My father's trust. $70 million that you all knew about while I was kept in the dark. I know you've been planning this for months, probably since the day Sloane Merrick confirmed the trust was mine. I know everything. The room went silent. Garrett's face was drained of color. Felicity's triumphant smile vanished. Marguerite's carefully maintained composure cracked just enough to show the calculating panic underneath. How did you? Garrett started, then stopped, realizing that how she knew mattered less than what she knew. Elara stepped back toward the door, her hand on the knob, her other hand protective over her belly where her baby moved like it was cheering her on. I'm leaving. Tonight. And when I come back, it'll be with lawyers who'll make sure you regret every moment of the past 2 years. Marguerite moved forward, her voice sharp with command. You walk out of here tonight, you'll regret it. We have resources, connections, power you can't imagine. We'll destroy you. And there it was, the truth beneath 2 years of false kindness, the reality of what they'd always been willing to do if she stepped out of line. But Elara wasn't afraid anymore. Fear required caring what they thought, and she was fresh out of caring. Try it. She opened the door, stepped into the hallway where party sounds drifted from the ballroom, turned back to look at them one last time. Oh, and Garrett? The baby and I, we'll be just fine without you. Better than fine, actually. She walked away, leaving them standing in shocked silence, and made her way through the party crowd that parted for her like they could sense something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the woman they'd dismissed as manageable. She found her coat, her purse with the documents she'd hidden there that morning, and walked out the front door into the cold December night. The iron gates opened as she approached, and Elara Winterbourne drove away from the estate that had been her prison, 8 months pregnant and alone, and absolutely certain that she'd just won a war they didn't even know they'd started. Behind her, inside that perfect house with its crystal and marble and generations of control, Garrett stood in the drawing room and realized he'd just lost everything, including the wife he'd never deserved and the inheritance he'd never have access to. Would you have walked away like that, pregnant and powerful, choosing dignity over acceptance? Or would you have stayed and fought in that room, demanding apologies and explanations they'd never have given honestly? Elara chose the third option. She walked away and let them drown in the consequences of their own cruelty, which was the sweetest revenge of all. Elara drove through the night until she reached her mother's house, That small home with the garden where tomatoes grew in summer, the place she should never have left. Her mother opened the door in her bathrobe, took one look at Alara's face, and pulled her inside without a single question. Just arms around her and the smell of home and safety she'd forgotten existed. "I've got you, baby. Whatever happened, I've got you." And Alara broke, finally, completely, sobbing against her mother's shoulder, while 2 years of held back pain poured out in waves that shook her whole body. She told her everything that night, every humiliation, every manipulation, every moment she'd smiled through cruelty and called it love. Her mother listened with a face that cycled through rage and heartbreak and a determination that reminded Alara where she'd gotten her own strength from. "They don't know who they're dealing with," her mother said quietly when Alara finally ran out of words. "They thought they could break my daughter. They're about to learn what a mistake that was." The next morning, Alara called Sloan Merrick, the attorney whose name had been on all those documents, and his secretary put her through immediately like he'd been waiting for her call. His voice was professional, careful, but she heard relief underneath. "Ms. Whitmore, I've been trying to reach you for months. Your husband intercepted my communications. I'm glad you finally know the truth." They met that afternoon in his office downtown, a space of dark wood and leather chairs that smelled like old books and expensive cigars. Sloan was in his 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, and he laid out the situation with the precision of someone who'd spent his career dealing with families like the Winterbournes. "Your father wasn't who you thought he was. Charles Whitmore had a second identity, built a fortune in tech before you were born, established a trust with specific instructions. The money was always meant for you, but the conditions required verification of identity, documentation, legal processes that took years. It was finalized 6 months ago, and I sent notice to your marital address as required by law. Your husband signed for it. You never saw it." Alara felt fury settle into her bones like concrete, solid and unshakable. "He kept it from me. Let me think I had nothing while planning to divorce me and take what was mine." Sloan nodded grimly. Standard predatory behavior in wealthy families. They see marriage as a business transaction, inheritances as assets to acquire. But the trust is ironclad, Ms. Whitmore. Every penny belongs to you, untouchable by marital claims, because it was established before your marriage. He can't access it. Neither can his family. The relief was physical, like breathing after being underwater too long. "What do I do now?" Sloan's smile was sharp as a blade. Now we make them pay for every moment they make you suffer." The legal battle started immediately, Sloan filing paperwork that hit the Winterbourne family like a tactical strike. Divorce proceedings with full financial transparency required. Restraining orders preventing contact. Custody arrangements that prioritize the mother's rights and the child's well-being over the father's convenience. Asset freezes on accounts Garrett had moved around assuming Alara would never notice or care. Within 48 hours, Garrett was calling, his voice tight with panic masquerading as reason. "Alara, we need to talk. Your lawyer is being unreasonable. Let's settle this privately, like adults." She let him finish, let him dig his hole deeper with every word, then spoke with a coldness she'd learned from Marguerite herself. "You had 2 years to treat me like an adult, Garrett. You chose to treat me like a problem to be managed. Now deal with the consequences." She hung up before he could respond, blocked his number, and felt power settle into her bones where fear used to live. Her mother watched from the kitchen doorway, pride clear on her face. "That's my girl. That's the daughter I raised." And Alara realized she'd spent 2 years forgetting who she'd been before the Winterbournes tried to remake her. But that woman had been there all along, just waiting for permission to fight back. The baby came 3 weeks later, a daughter with Alara's eyes, and a cry that sounded like fury and determination mixed together. She named her Charlotte, after her father, the man who'd left her a fortune and a lesson. Never let anyone make you believe you're less than you are. The Winterbournes tried to visit the hospital, showed up with flowers and gifts and apologies that meant nothing. But Alara's lawyer had already filed the restraining orders and security escorted them out, while Marguerite's perfect composure finally cracked into rage. You can't keep us from our grandchild. We have rights. But they didn't, not really, not when their son had planned to humiliate and discard the mother. Not when their own documented correspondence proved conspiracy and manipulation. The judge had been clear, supervised visitation only, and only if Alara agreed, which she hadn't yet and might never. Garrett called through his lawyer, making threats and demands and offers of settlement that were laughable compared to what Alara actually controlled. His company, it turned out, was bleeding money, having been for months, sustained only by investments and loans that were coming due. Felicity had abandoned him the moment his financial situation became public, her supposed love evaporating the instant it couldn't benefit her, and Garrett was learning what Alara had learned 2 years ago. The winterborn world only wanted you if you were useful. 3 months after Charlotte's birth, Sloane walked into Alara's new apartment, the penthouse she'd bought with cash in a building far from the winterborn estate, and handed her a folder with a smile that promised satisfaction. You're not going to believe this, but you should probably sit down. Inside was an opportunity she hadn't anticipated. Garrett's company was facing foreclosure. The board was forcing a sale, and the primary creditor willing to buy them out was a holding company that Sloane's firm had quietly established on Alara's behalf. You could own his company. Every asset, every contract, every deal he's ever made. It's poetic justice, really. Alara looked at the numbers, the projections, the reality that she could take everything Garrett had ever valued and remake it in her own image. The old Alara would have hesitated, would have worried about seeming vindictive, about stooping to their level. The new Alara, the one holding her daughter while reading documents that gave her power over the people who tried to destroy her, didn't hesitate at all. Do it. Buy them out. Restructure everything. And make sure Garrett knows exactly who owns him now. Sloane's grin was pure satisfaction. This is why I love my job. The acquisition happened quietly, announced through press releases that sent shockwaves through the social circles that had watched Alara's humiliation and expected her to disappear. Instead, she became one of the wealthiest women in the state, a single mother with a tech company and a trust fund, and the kind of power that made people who dismissed her suddenly desperate for her attention. The calls started coming, pathetic and predictable. Caroline reached out through a mutual acquaintance, asking if they could talk, claiming she'd always thought what her family did was wrong even though she'd sat silently through all of it. Alara didn't respond. Marguerite sent a letter, handwritten on expensive stationery, explaining that she'd only wanted what was best for everyone, and perhaps they'd all made mistakes that could be forgiven. Alara burned it without reading past the first paragraph. Felicity tried to schedule lunch, her assistant claiming Ms. Dane wanted to apologize and rebuild their friendship, apparently unaware that friendship required mutual respect and loyalty, neither of which Felicity had ever actually offered. Alara had her assistant send back a message. Ms. Whitmore doesn't accept meetings with people who sleep with married men. Direct, brutal, and according to her assistant, Felicity had turned white when she received it. But Garrett was the most persistent, showing up at her building until security banned him, sending letters that started demanding and evolved into begging, leaving voicemails that progressed from anger to desperation to something that almost sounded like genuine regret. Alara, please. I made a mistake. I was stupid. I was weak. I let my family manipulate me. But I loved you. I still love you. We can fix this. We can be a family. She listened to one voicemail, just one, and heard in his voice the same desperation she'd felt when he'd told her their marriage was over. The difference was she'd been desperate because she'd actually loved him. He was desperate because he'd lost access to money and power and the easy life his family's name had always provided. 6 months after the New Year's party that was supposed to be her humiliation, Alara walked into the Winterborn Company headquarters, her daughter's nanny waiting in the car outside, her lawyer beside her, and her heels clicking against marble floors with the confidence of someone who owned everything in sight, because she literally did. The board meeting was already in progress, Garrett at the head of the table where he'd sat for years, conducting business like he still had authority. He looked up when she entered, and the color drained from his face so fast she thought he might pass out. What are you doing here? His voice cracked on the question, and several board members shifted uncomfortably. clearly already briefed on the change in ownership. Alara smiled, took the seat at the head of table that had always been his, and waited until he moved because she owned his chair now too. Board meeting. I'm the majority shareholder now, or did your lawyers not explain that part? She opened her folder, pulled out documents, and addressed the room with the authority of someone who'd spent 2 years learning how power actually worked in these circles. Effective immediately, there will be changes. New management, new priorities, new leadership. Mr. Winterbourne will be staying on in a reduced capacity, assuming he agrees to the terms. She slid a contract across the table toward Garrett, and he picked it up with shaking hands, reading terms that basically made him an employee in the company that bore his family's name. Would you have offered him even that much? Or would you have fired him outright, made him feel the complete loss of everything he'd taken for granted? Garrett looked up from the contract, his face a mix of disbelief and something that might have been respected if it wasn't 20 years too late. You planned this. All of it. Alara shook her head. No. You planned your betrayal. I just refuse to be destroyed by it. There's a difference. She stood, gathered her papers, and prepared to leave while the board members sat in stunned silence, witnessing a reversal of power so complete it would become legend in their circles. But before she left, she turned back, looked at Garrett one last time, and gave him the truth he'd never given her. I would have loved you forever. I would have stood by you through anything. I would have been the partner you needed if you'd ever bothered to see me as a partner instead of a problem. You threw away something real for something temporary, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you destroyed the best thing that ever happened to you. His eyes filled with tears, genuine regret finally breaking through. But it was too late, years too late, and Alara walked out of that boardroom with her head high and her heart finally free of the man who tried to break it. The elevator doors closed on Garrett's devastated face, and Alara allowed herself one moment of satisfaction before moving forward into the life she was building, the one where she made the rules, and no one ever underestimated her again. The transformation happened gradually over the following months. Calculated moves that looked like business decisions, but were actually strategic acts of justice. Alara worked from her penthouse office, Charlotte sleeping in a crib by her desk, while Sloane brought her reports that read like karma made manifest. Garrett's company, now hers, was hemorrhaging talent and clients, people who'd sensed the instability and jumped ship before the whole thing sank. But Alara wasn't interested in letting it sink. She was interested in rebuilding it into something that reflected her values instead of Winterbourne arrogance, and that required surgery, not burial. She started by replacing the board, bringing in women and minorities that the old guard would never have considered, people with actual talent instead of inherited connections. The Winterbourne name stayed on the building because erasing it would have been petty, but the culture underneath changed completely. Meritocracy replaced nepotism. Innovation replaced tradition. Accountability replaced the kind of entitlement that had allowed Garrett to think he could discard his pregnant wife without consequences. Within 6 months, the company was profitable again. Headlines praising the mysterious new owner who'd turned around a sinking ship, and Garrett had to watch it all happen while working in an office that used to be a supply closet, his title reduced to consultant, his opinions sought by nobody. But the real reversal happened behind the scenes, in ways Garrett and his family wouldn't discover until it was far too late. Alara remembered every slight, every humiliation, every moment they'd used their power to make her feel small, and she had learned from masters. Marguerite's favorite charity, the one she chaired with such pride, suddenly found its major donors pulling out, redirecting their contributions to organizations that actually served communities instead of serving as social networking events for the wealthy. The charity didn't fold, but Marguerite's position became untenable, and she resigned in disgrace 3 months later, replaced by someone who actually cared about the cause. Caroline's husband, whose company had always depended on Winterbourne connections and contracts, found those connections suddenly unavailable, those contracts awarded to competitors. His business struggling in ways he couldn't quite trace back to a single source, but knew somehow involved his sister-in-law's revenge. Felicity discovered that her social currency had evaporated overnight. Invitations to exclusive events stopped coming, and her supposed friends distanced themselves with the speed of people who'd never actually liked her, but had tolerated her because of her proximity to power that no longer existed. She tried calling Garrett for support and found his number changed. She tried reaching out to mutual friends and discovered she didn't actually have any. She ended up leaving the city entirely, moving back to her parents' estate in Connecticut, a 35-year-old woman retreating to childhood because the adult life she'd built on manipulation and betrayal had collapsed the moment her victims stopped being victims. Garrett's fall was more personal, more complete, because Alara had loved him once, and his betrayal had cut deeper than anyone else's. She bought the estate, the Winterbourne family home that had been in their family for generations. When they were forced to sell it to cover debts they'd accumulated trying to maintain appearances they could no longer afford. She didn't move in, didn't even visit it, just owned it and let it sit empty, while Garrett and Marguerite lived in a penthouse apartment downtown that was luxurious by normal standards, but must have felt like poverty to people who'd measured worth by how much space they controlled. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. The house where they'd made her feel unwelcome now belonged to her, and they couldn't set foot in it without her permission, which she never gave. His mother tried one more manipulation. 6 months into Alara's silent siege on everything they valued. Marguerite showed up at Alara's building lobby, security calling up for permission, and Alara, curious about what play the matriarch had left, agreed to 5 minutes in the coffee shop next door. Marguerite looked smaller somehow, her perfection cracking at the edges, her clothes still expensive, but no longer new, her composure maintained through visible effort instead of effortless grace. She sat across from Alara, ordered nothing, and launched into the speech she'd clearly practiced. I underestimated you. I'll admit that. I thought you were weak, malleable, easy to control. I was wrong. Alara sipped her coffee, said nothing, let the silence do the work of making Marguerite uncomfortable, a tactic she'd learned from the woman now squirming across from her. What happened at New Year's, the way we handled it, that was a mistake. We should have been honest with you from the beginning, should have treated you as family instead of as an outsider we were tolerating. The apology was hollow, delivered without real remorse, just another manipulation attempting to secure some advantage Marguerite thought still existed. Alara set down her cup carefully. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry it didn't work. There's a difference. Marguerite's mask slipped for just a second, frustration flashing across her face before control reasserted itself. I'm trying to make amends. For my son's sake, for my grandchild's sake. Charlotte deserves to know her father's family. And there it was, the real agenda. Using the baby as leverage the same way they tried to use everything else. Alara leaned forward, her voice quiet but absolutely firm. Charlotte will know her grandmother, my mother, who loved me unconditionally and taught me that family means support, not control. She won't know you unless I decide she needs an example of what not to become. Right now, I haven't decided that lesson is necessary. She stood, gathering her bag, done with the conversation before Marguerite could deploy whatever other tactics she'd prepared. You spent 2 years teaching me how your world works. Power, leverage, consequences. I was a good student. This is what you taught me. This is what I learned. Don't complain about the lesson now that you're on the receiving end. Marguerite's composure shattered completely, her voice rising enough to turn heads in the coffee shop. You can't keep punishing us forever. We're family, whether you like it or not. That matters. Alara turned back, and when she spoke, every word carried the weight of 2 years of accumulated pain and hard-won strength. You're not my family. You never were. The family doesn't humiliate each other. The family doesn't plot betrayals over tea and charity luncheons. Family doesn't treat love like a transaction with terms and conditions. You taught me that I wasn't family when you spent 2 years trying to remake me into someone you could tolerate. Now you get to live with what you created. She walked away while Marguerite sat frozen, finally understanding that the girl they tried to break had become someone who could break them back without raising her voice or losing her composure. Someone who'd learned their game and played it better than they ever had. Would you have given them even that much conversation? Or would you have refused the meeting entirely, let them wonder and worry without the closure of explanation? Alara chose to give them the truth one last time because, unlike them, she didn't believe in leaving people in the dark about why they were suffering. They knew. They'd know every day forward that their own cruelty had architected their downfall. The silent campaign continued through the summer and into fall, each move calculated for maximum impact with minimum visibility. Alara discovered, through the kind of research money could buy, that Garrett had been moving assets during their marriage, hiding money in accounts he thought she'd never find, preparing for the divorce months before he'd actually initiated it. Sloane's team traced every transaction, documented every transfer, and filed everything with the court, transforming what Garrett had thought was clever planning into evidence of fraud and intent to deceive. The judge was not impressed. The settlement that had seemed generous. When Garrett offered, it became laughable when stacked against what the court now ordered him to pay. Child support that would ensure Charlotte lived the life she deserved. Restitution for the emotional distress of calculated betrayal. Penalties for the hidden assets and the attempted manipulation of the legal process. By the time the final judgment came down, Garrett had lost more than his company and his home. He'd lost the comfortable future he'd assumed would always be his, the one where consequences didn't apply to people with the right last name and enough money to buy their way out of accountability. He called Alara after the judgment, his voice raw with desperation that might have moved her once, but now just sounded like the natural result of choices he'd made. "You've taken everything. Are you satisfied now? Is this enough revenge for you?" She could have hung up. Should have, probably. But something in his voice demanded response, the same way his betrayal had demanded justice. "This isn't revenge, Garrett. Revenge would be personal, emotional, about making you feel pain because I felt pain. This is the consequence. You and your family spent 2 years teaching me that actions have outcomes, that weakness gets exploited, that power matters more than kindness. I learned the lesson. I'm just better at applying it than you ever were." His breath caught, a sound that might have been a sob. "I loved you. I know you don't believe me, but I did. I just got caught up in what my family wanted, what Felicity offered, what I thought I was supposed to want. And I lost the only thing that actually mattered." The confession came too late, years too late, and Alara felt nothing hearing it except a distant sadness for the marriage that could have been if he'd chosen differently. "You didn't love me enough to choose me over your family's expectations. You didn't love me enough to stand up for me when they criticized everything I was. You didn't love me enough to be honest when you decided you wanted someone else. That's not love, Garrett. That's convenience mistaking itself for affection. And I deserve more than convenience." She ended the call before he could respond, blocked the number for the final time, and felt the last thread connecting her to that part of her life snap clean. The next day, Sloane brought her the final documents, the ones that made the divorce absolute and irrevocable, that restored her legal name to Alara Whitmore instead of Alara Winterbourne, that officially erased every tie except the daughter, who was the only good thing that marriage had produced. She signed them while Charlotte played on the floor with blocks, building towers and knocking them down with delighted laughter, learning early that destruction and creation were both part of life's natural rhythm. "It's done," Sloane said, his voice carrying satisfaction and genuine respect. "You're free. Completely, legally, financially free. And for what it's worth, watching you handle this has been the highlight of my career. Most people in your situation crumble. You built an empire." Alara looked at her daughter, thought about the life they'd build together, the lessons she'd teach about strength and dignity and never letting anyone make you smaller than you are. "They thought I was weak because I was kind. They thought I was stupid because I trusted them. They mistook patience for passivity and gentleness for inability to fight back. That was their mistake, not mine." She gathered the signed documents, handed them back to Sloane, and felt the final weight lift from her shoulders, the weight of being defined by people who'd never bothered to actually know her. "I didn't build an empire for revenge. I built it so my daughter would never have to depend on anyone who might betray her, so she'd always have choices, so she'd know that being underestimated by cruel people is an advantage, not a weakness. The Winterbournes taught me that lesson accidentally. I'm teaching it to Charlotte intentionally." Sloane smiled, shook her hand with the formality of someone recognizing an equal, and left her office with the documents that would be filed tomorrow, making the dissolution final. Alara returned to her desk, to the work of running a company and raising a daughter and building a life that belonged entirely to her. And she did look back at the ruins of what the Winterbournes had been, because looking back would imply she cared about their suffering when really, she'd simply moved forward and let them drown in the consequences they'd created for themselves. That was the real power she'd learned. Not revenge, but indifference. Not destruction, but the quiet knowledge that she'd won by refusing to stay defeated. Would you have felt satisfied with this victory? Or would you have wanted more, some final confrontation, some moment where they admitted their wrongs and begged forgiveness? Alara chose satisfaction over closure, because closure required their participation, and she was done needing anything from them at all. The final confrontation came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after that New Year's Eve party, timing that Alara hadn't planned, but appreciated for its poetic symmetry. Garrett showed up at her office building unannounced, bypassing security by claiming he had custody business to discuss, which was technically true even though his supervised visitation rights had been suspended for missed payments and documented instability. Her assistant buzzed through with an apology in her voice. "Ms. Whitmore, your ex-husband is here. Security is ready to remove him, but he's asking for 5 minutes. He says it's about Charlotte." Alara looked at her daughter, now 15 months old and napping peacefully in the playpen by her desk, oblivious to the drama that had defined the first year of her life. She could have had him removed, should have probably, but something in her wanted this final conversation, the closing statement on a chapter that deserved a proper ending. Send him in, but tell security to stay close. Garrett entered looking nothing like the confident man who'd stood in that drawing room and calmly destroyed their marriage. His suit was off the rack, his haircut overdue, his face carrying the weight of a year spent watching everything he'd taken for granted crumble into dust. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes going immediately to Charlotte, and something in his expression broke that might have been genuine love, or might have been grief for what he'd thrown away. "She's gotten so big." His voice cracked on the words, and Alara felt something twist in her chest that might have been pity if she hadn't spent 12 months learning that pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You're not here to see Charlotte. You lost that right when you stopped making support payments. What do you want, Garrett?" She kept her voice level, professional, the tone she used in board meetings when dealing with people who'd wasted her time. He flinched at the coldness, but pushed forward, moving closer until he stood across her desk, the physical barrier between them symbolic of everything that separated who they'd been from who they'd become. "I'm here to beg. I'm here to get on my knees, if that's what it takes. I'm here to tell you that destroying my life wasn't enough, that I'm bankrupt, that I'm living in my mother's spare bedroom, that every door I knock on closes in my face because your lawyers made sure everyone knows what I did." His hands gripped the edge of her desk, knuckles white with pressure. "I'm here to ask what more you want from me, because I have nothing left to take." Alara stood slowly, walked around the desk, until she was close enough to see the desperation in his eyes, the complete collapse of the man who'd once had the power to make her feel worthless. "I don't want anything from you. I never did. That's what you never understood. I didn't destroy your life for revenge. I destroyed it because you destroyed mine first, and I refuse to be the only one carrying the consequences of your choices." She stepped back, creating distance that felt like protection. "You want to know what I want now? I want you to understand that actions have outcomes. I want you to live every day knowing that the comfortable future you threw away for a woman who abandoned you the second your money dried. Up was real, was valuable, was something you'll never get back. I want you to be the lesson I teach Charlotte about what happens when you treat people like they're disposable." Garrett's face crumpled, tears streaming down cheeks that had never shown vulnerability in all the time she'd known him, and watching him break should have felt satisfying, but instead just felt hollow, empty of the triumph she'd expected. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable, but she's my daughter too. Please don't take her away from me completely. Let me be part of her life, even if it's supervised, even if it's just an hour a month. I'm begging you." And there it was, the moment Alara had to decide who she was going to be, the woman who'd learned to be as cruel as the people who'd hurt her, or the woman who'd survived their cruelty by refusing to become them. She looked at Charlotte, sleeping peacefully, innocent of all the adult pain and betrayal that had brought her into existence, and made the only choice that let her sleep at night. You'll see her. Supervised visits twice a month with conditions. You show up sober. You show up on time. You treat her with respect and love. You pay your support on schedule. You rebuild your life into something stable. And most importantly, you never, ever speak badly about me in front of her. She deserves a father who's present, who's trying, who's learned from his mistakes. If you can be that, we'll figure this out. If you can't, then you've lost her by your own choices, not mine. Relief flooded his face so completely it almost made him look young again, almost made him look like the man she'd fallen in love with before wealth and family and Felicity Dane had corrupted whatever goodness he'd possessed. Thank you. God, Alara, thank you. I won't mess this up. I swear I'll do everything right this time. She held up a hand, stopping his gratitude before it became uncomfortable. Don't thank me. Thank your daughter, who deserves a chance to know her father. And don't swear you'll do everything right, because you won't. You'll mess up, you'll be late sometimes, you'll disappoint her. That's part of being a parent. What matters is showing up anyway, doing better next time, proving through actions instead of words that you care enough to keep trying. She walked him to the door, one hand on the handle, ready to close this chapter finally and completely. One more thing. Your mother has been reaching out through back channels, trying to arrange meetings with Charlotte. That stops now. Marguerite doesn't get access to my daughter until she can demonstrate that she's changed, that she understands what she did wrong, that she's capable of loving Charlotte without trying to control her or use her as a pawn. And honestly, I don't think that day is coming. Garrett nodded, defeated even in this small victory he'd been granted. My mother made her choices too. She'll have to live with the consequences, same as me. He paused at the threshold, turned back one more time. For what it's worth, you were right. About everything. I threw away something real for something temporary, and I'll regret it every day for the rest of my life. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. Alara met his eyes, saw genuine remorse finally breaking through the selfishness that had defined him, and gave him the only truth that mattered. I know I deserve better. That's why I built better. And Garrett, I hope someday you build better too. Not for me, not even for Charlotte really. For yourself. Because the man who could betray his pregnant wife that casually is living in a prison even if he doesn't recognize the bars. She closed the door on his stunned face, returned to her desk where Charlotte was waking up, stretching tiny arms and blinking sleepy eyes, and picked up her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd fought battles most people couldn't imagine. It's just us, baby girl. Just us against the world, and we're going to be just fine. The weeks that followed brought unexpected peace. Garrett showed up for his first supervised visit on time, sober, bearing a stuffed animal and visible nervousness. He held Charlotte awkwardly at first, like he'd forgotten how to be gentle, but by the end of the hour something had shifted in him. Some recognition that this tiny person was his responsibility regardless of how he felt about her mother. The supervisor reported back that he'd been appropriate, engaged, visibly emotional when he had to leave. He's trying, the supervisor said. Whether he can maintain it, that's the question. But right now he's trying. Alara accepted the report, filed it away, and let herself hope cautiously that maybe, her daughter would have a father who learned from destruction how to build something worthwhile. Marguerite tried once more, showing up at Alara's office building with the kind of determination that had probably worked for her entire life, expecting that persistence would eventually wear down any resistance. Alara met her in the lobby this time, unwilling to let her anywhere near Charlotte, and the older woman looked diminished somehow, her armor of perfection cracked by a year of consequences she'd never experienced before. Please, let me see my granddaughter. I'm asking nicely, which is something I've never had to do, but I'm asking. Alara studied the woman who'd spent 2 years systematically undermining her confidence, who'd orchestrated humiliation with the precision of someone who considered cruelty a social skill, and found she felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction at her downfall, just empty recognition of someone who'd created her own isolation. You don't get to see Charlotte until you can tell me, specifically and honestly, what you did wrong. Not what went wrong. Not how things didn't work out the way you planned. What you did was wrong. Marguerite's mouth opened, closed, and Alara could see the calculation happening. The woman trying to figure out what answer would get her what she wanted rather than what answer was true. I underestimated you. That was my mistake. Wrong answer. Alara shook her head. That's not what you did wrong. That's just you being surprised that I fought back. Try again. Marguerite's composure cracked, frustration breaking through. What do you want me to say? That I was cruel? That I treated you poorly? Fine. I treated you poorly. I was cruel. Now can I see my grandchild? Still wrong, still missing the point entirely. And Alara realized that Marguerite might never actually understand what she'd done, might never be capable of the kind of self-reflection that required admitting fault without immediate benefit. I want you to say that you were wrong to judge me for my background. That you were wrong to try to control every aspect of my life. That you were wrong to help your son betray his pregnant wife. That you were wrong to value appearance and status over basic human decency. Until you can say those things and mean them, until you can demonstrate that you've changed, you don't get access to Charlotte. She deserves better than a grandmother who'll spend 18 years trying to remake her into something more suitable. Marguerite's face went through several expressions, rage and disbelief, and finally something that might have been recognition. And when she spoke, her voice carried defeat instead of determination. You've become exactly what I tried to make you. Cold, calculating, willing to use a child as leverage. Congratulations, Alara. You learned the lesson perfectly. The accusation should have stung, but instead just bounced off the armor Alara had built from 2 years of surviving people like Marguerite. No. I learned to protect myself and the people I love from toxic people who think manipulation is the same as strength. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't see it is exactly why you don't get to be part of Charlotte's life. She walked away while Marguerite stood frozen in the lobby, security already moving toward her, and Alara didn't look back because looking back would imply uncertainty, and she was completely, absolutely certain that she'd made the right choice. The months turned into a year, then 2, and life took on a rhythm that felt sustainable instead of exhausting. Charlotte grew into a toddler who asked constant questions and gave enthusiastic hugs and showed no signs of the trauma that had surrounded her birth. Garrett maintained his visitation schedule, slowly rebuilding trust through consistency and genuine effort, never quite becoming someone Alara could respect, but at least becoming someone Charlotte could rely on. Marguerite faded into absence, her attempts at contact growing less frequent until they stopped entirely. And Alara heard through professional channels that she'd moved to Europe, leaving behind the city where she'd once held so much power that had evaporated the moment people realized it was borrowed and conditional. Felicity appeared once more, 3 years after everything had imploded. At a charity event Alara attended more for networking than passion, and the woman looked haunted, diminished, like life had systematically stripped away everything she'd valued about herself. She approached Alara during cocktail hour with a kind of desperation that makes people forget pride. Can we talk? Just 5 minutes. I need to apologize. Alara looked at this woman who'd pretended friendship while planning betrayal, who'd slept with her husband while offering advice on how to save her marriage, who'd been so certain that youth and beauty and calculated seduction would secure the life she wanted. No, we can't. There's nothing you could say that would matter now. You made your choices. Live with them. She walked away from Felicity's stricken face, from the past that kept trying to pull her backward, and found her assistant waiting with schedule updates and contract negotiations that mattered infinitely more than old grudges. The company thrived under her leadership, becoming known for innovation and ethical practices instead of the cutthroat tradition the Winterbourne name had represented. Alara hired people from backgrounds like hers, gave opportunities to women who'd been overlooked and minorities who'd been dismissed, built an organization that reflected her values instead of inherited prejudices. The work was fulfilling in ways the marriage never had been, challenging without being destructive, demanding without being demeaning. She dated occasionally, nothing serious, unwilling to risk the peace she'd built for the uncertainty of new relationships, and found she was content alone in ways she'd never been when coupled with someone who'd made her feel lonely even in the same room. Charlotte thrived, growing into a confident child who knew she was loved, who had a mother who'd fight for her and a father who was learning to be present, who knew nothing about the dramatic circumstances of her birth because children deserved innocence until they were old enough to understand complexity. On Charlotte's 5th birthday, Ilara stood in their home watching her daughter laugh with friends, surrounded by love and stability and the kind of childhood she herself had once known before the Winterbournes tried to convince her it wasn't enough, and felt complete in a way she'd never felt trying to fit into spaces that weren't meant for her. Her mother appeared at her elbow, the grandmother Charlotte actually knew and adored, and squeezed her hand with the pride of someone who'd watched her daughter survive hell and come out stronger. You did it, sweetheart. You built something real from the ashes of something false. I'm so proud of you. Ilara leaned into her mother's shoulder, this woman who'd always been there, who'd loved her unconditionally when others had offered affection with terms and conditions attached. I couldn't have done it without you. You taught me that strength and kindness aren't opposites, that you can be both gentle and fierce, that surviving people who tried to break you is its own kind of victory. They stood together watching Charlotte blow out candles, make wishes only 5-year-olds believe in, and Ilara realized that the real triumph wasn't the money or the company or the revenge that had felt so necessary a few years ago. The real triumph was standing here, whole and healed and free, raising a daughter who would never have to learn the lessons Ilara had learned because she'd break the cycle before it could start. She'd been a small-town girl who thought marrying into wealth was a fairy tale, who'd learned that some castles are prisons, who'd been humiliated and discarded when she was 8 months pregnant and supposedly powerless. But she'd been wrong about the powerless part. She'd always had power, had always been stronger than they'd realized, had simply needed to remember who she was before they tried to convince her she was less. Would you have rebuilt your life the way Ilara did, with forgiveness for some and consequences for others, with boundaries that protected without destroying? Or would you have burned every bridge and started completely over? Ilara chose the middle path, the one that let her daughter have a father who was trying and grandparents who cared while still protecting her from people who couldn't change. And that balance, that careful navigation between mercy and justice, was the real measure of strength. The Winterbournes had wanted to make her one of them, to shape her into something that fit their world. Instead, she'd taken everything they tried to teach her about power and used it to build a world where she made the rules, where kindness and strength coexisted, where people were valued for who they were instead of who they could become. That was the lesson she'd teach Charlotte. Not that wealth and power mattered, but that character and resilience mattered more. Not that revenge was sweet, but that building a life you could be proud of was sweeter than any vengeance. Not that you should destroy people who hurt you, but that you should build something so strong, so true, so undeniably yours that their opinions became irrelevant and their power over you dissolved like it was never real in the first place. Ilara Whitmore stood in her home, surrounded by people who loved her for who she actually was, and felt the final weight of the Winterbourne legacy lift from her shoulders. She'd walked into their world as a girl hoping to be accepted. She'd walked out as a woman who'd learned that acceptance from the wrong people was worthless, that building her own world was better than fitting into someone else's, that some stories don't end with happily ever after, but with hard-won peace and the knowledge that you survived what should have destroyed you and came out unbreakable on the other side. And that, she'd learned, was the best kind of victory, the kind that didn't require their acknowledgement or their regret or their understanding. The kind that only required her truth and her strength and her refusal to let cruelty have the final word. She was free. Completely, finally, absolutely free. And that was enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most.